Genesis and the age of the earth are lively topics of ongoing debate. There are several conflicting views among Christians. So, what should we do when science and Scripture seem to be telling us different stories? As we said last time, we listen to both of God's revelations. First, we'll look at what Scripture says, then see what we can learn by studying nature, and then see how we can bring both of them together. While Christians together affirm the authority of Scripture, we sometimes disagree about how best to interpret some passages. Genesis 1 is such a passage. At the center of the debate is whether or not it conveys scientific information about how the world was created. We'll start by summarizing 5 of the most common interpretations of Genesis 1. The first 3 interpretations are concordist, which means they say that creation happened historically in the same order as the days in Genesis 1. The young earth interpretation, which gained in popularity a few decades ago, says that God created the earth around 10,000 years ago in 6 literal days, and Genesis 1 is intended to be a literal historical account. A second interpretation, which was especially popular in the 19th and early 20th centuries and is still popular today, is the day-age interpretation, the view that creation happened over billions of years in the same order as Genesis 1, but each day in Genesis 1 represents a long period of time. A third view is the appearance of age interpretation, the theory that creation occurred around 10,000 years ago in 6 literal days, but God created Earth to look billions of years old. A second set of views are called non-concordist interpretations, which say that the days of Genesis 1 are better understood not as literal, but as a literary device. The creation poem interpretation sees in Genesis 1 a rhythm and repetition of ideas and phrases, with a numbering and ordering of days chosen for poetic reasons rather than scientific ones.
But what about that concept we talked about last time, the importance of considering the original intent of the passage? That leads us to our 5th interpretation. How did the ancient Near East people view the cosmos? Well, back then, the Hebrew people were surrounded by the nations of Egypt and Babylon and Canaan. These cultures believed that the world began as a dark, watery chaos, then formed into a flat earth, covered by a solid dome sky with water above the sky. Now, this picture sounds strange to us, but it's right there in Genesis 1 and in many other places in the Old Testament. In fact, a completely literal interpretation of Genesis 1 would require believing that the sky is a solid dome and not a gaseous atmosphere. So that means in Genesis 1, God was not revealing new scientific information. In fact, if God had included a spherical earth and a gaseous atmosphere in Genesis 1, it would have completely confused the original audience, and they would have missed the point. But as we compare Genesis 1 to the creation stories of the surrounding cultures, what really stands out are the theological differences. Egypt and Babylon were both polytheistic cultures. They believed in multiple gods, the sky god, the land god, the air god, and so on. So imagine you're an ancient Israelite sitting around the campfire, hearing Genesis 1 for the first time. The solid dome firmament on day 2 wouldn't have surprised you at all. But the main points would be obvious. These so-called gods of Egypt and Babylon are not real. The land and the sky and the sun, those are just physical things that God made, not gods in themselves. There is only one God, the creator of all things, and humans are a very good part of his creation.
When I first started studying geology and astronomy, I had trouble reconciling the science with my interpretation of Genesis. But when biblical scholars told me about this reading of Genesis, it finally showed me how to bring together both sides of the story. Instead of a scientific explanation of creation, we find that God accommodated his message in Genesis 1 to the people's understanding of the time. This liberates us from the idea that we have to understand all of science in order to understand Scripture. As science advances from the 20th century into the 21st and 22nd, we don't have to continually change our interpretation of Genesis because it wasn't meant to match modern science. Genesis 1 is less concerned with the how and the when of creation and more concerned with the who and the why. There is one God, and our Creator loves us. The original audience of Genesis 1 heard it as a beautiful theological manifesto proclaiming the authority of God, the goodness of creation, and human dignity. And that is how we hear it today.
You can decide for yourself which of those interpretations of Genesis you think is best. As you mull those over, let's turn to God's other story in nature and see what it has to say. In the 16 and 1700s, most geologists were Christians. They went out into the field looking at rocks, expecting to find evidence for a young Earth and a global flood. Instead, they were surprised at what they learned from studying God's creation. They found more and more evidence that the Earth is much older. Like tree rings, some elements in nature contain clues about their age. One of these is glaciers. Glaciers actually have layers that you can count, like tree rings, because each year a glacier adds another layer of ice and snow. Geologists have found a glacier where you can count the layers back 720,000 years. That's many times longer than the 10,000-year timeline of young Earth creationism. Elsewhere on Earth, geologists have found layers of sedimentary rock, like these, that have slowly accumulated over even longer periods of time into much taller stacks, up to a mile high, pointing to millions of years of uninterrupted accumulation. Going even further back in time, a rock formation in Greenland has been dated using multiple radioactive isotopes to 3.6 billion years old, one of the oldest rock formations on Earth. And there's so much more geological evidence that we don't have time to explain. Conglomerate rocks, volcanic sequences, fossil series, and continental drift. There are multiple independent lines of evidence all pointing to the same story. The Earth is old.
If there's a lot of evidence in God's creation that the Earth is old, that evidence supports some interpretations of Genesis 1 and tends to undercut other interpretations. It's not that the science forces us to one particular interpretation. Rather, the science prompts us to go back to the biblical scholars and take a fresh look at how we do interpretation. In this case, we took another look at what Genesis 1 meant for the original audience, and we found, independent of the science, a deeper understanding of what God intended to teach. For me, bringing together the geology with the ancient Near East interpretation of Genesis was like bringing together for the first time the audio and visual tracks of a movie. Once they were together, they didn't conflict. Rather, each enriched my understanding of the other. In Genesis 1, we find a beautiful statement of one sovereign God ruling over his good creation and our own very good place in it. God didn't make his original audience understand modern astronomy or genetics. He didn't make this a science textbook. Instead, he accommodated his message in a context they could understand. So, which interpretation of Genesis 1 is the best? That's an important question, but it's not the most important question. All of the interpretations we described here agree about the most important things. God is the one true God. He created the world and called it good.